evening. I'm Kevin Johnson, the Associate Professor of History and Global Studies and Chair of the History, Global, and Political Studies Department at Taylor University. And it's a privilege to be able to give this talk titled Queens and Commoners, the Rights and Roles of Women in Ancient Egypt, as part of the Carnegie Lecture Series for the History Center at the Marion Public Library. This is a topic that I find quite enjoyable, and I hope you find it of interest as well. Now, the modern fascination with the ancient Egyptian past really took off after the discovery of the largely intact royal tomb of King Tutankhamun in November of 1922. We're actually coming up upon the 100th anniversary of the discovery of quite possibly the most famous archaeological find in the modern era. You can see some of the images here of the items being photographed from King Tut's tomb, and also the excavator, Howard Carter, who's being photographed as he examines some of those objects. Since that time, Egyptian culture has inspired furniture and architectural designs. It's been relied upon to hawk cereal, cigarettes, and also for helping to advertise health products, such as the miracle drug aspirin. This particular poster in the top right-hand corner is in German, but the text translates, "Like the great works of art, aspirin has the superior effect." Now, I've always found it interesting that a product meant to invoke a sense of health and thus life would be advertised associated with an item that clearly relates to death. In addition, the big screen has long been enamored with Egypt when thinking of stories for the cinema, whether those are the sword and sandal flicks or ones that are a little scarier, such as Boris Karloff's portrayal of the Mummy. This continues on to the present, culminating in the recent popular series Moon Knight. And a common feature in many of those movies is the strong female characters that they feature. What seems obvious to even the most casual connoisseur of pop culture is that women from ancient Egypt somehow seem more exciting and even more glamorous. This is probably in some part attributed to amazing portrayals such as that by Liz Taylor in the movie Cleopatra. And you can go beyond the big screen to TV and comic books as well. Now, the study of ancient Egypt has also been of keen interest to females in the modern era as well. Here, this children's book is encouraging young girls to pursue a career in Egyptology. You can be a woman Egyptologist. Now, before you dismiss this book offhand, keep in mind this book is actually co-written by one of the foremost Egyptologists in the world, Betsy Bryan of Johns Hopkins University. But even contemporaries of pharaonic civilization from other cultures remarked on the unique position of women in ancient Egyptian society. None other than the Greek historian Herodotus in his history stated, "Not only is the Egyptian climate peculiar to that country and the Nile different in behavior to other rivers, but the Egyptians themselves, in most of their manners and customs, exactly reverse the common practices of mankind. For example, the women attend the markets and trade, while the men sit at home and weave at the loom. The women likewise carry burdens upon their shoulders, while the men carry them upon their heads." Now, Herodotus was a 5th century Greek, and his understanding of the roles of women back in the Greek city-states very much differed from the experience of women in Egypt in the 5th century. Now, there are a few caveats that we must sort of keep in mind when approaching a topic as broad as the rights and roles of women in ancient Egypt. First, it has to be remembered that pharaonic civilization lasted for over 3,000 years. Although Egypt was a very conservative society that did not necessarily embrace change, we know that even small incremental changes over the course of this scope of time can have an important effect. Second, when discussing the rights and the roles of women over a period spanning 3 millennia, we need to keep in mind that women did not form a single coherent group. Society in ancient Egypt was highly stratified, so the experiences and privileges of women would have varied depending on where they stood on that social scale. In this very simplified social pyramid of Egyptian society, women would have been part of every major level of society, from the very top all the way down to the bottom. So it stands to reason that a female who lived and enjoyed the status of maybe the second level would have had a very different kind of life than that existed at the very bottom of the social pyramid. Now, what determines status? What would determine where you fell on that particular social pyramid? Well, men were usually distinguished by the type of job that they had. That's what gave them their status. A woman's status was determined by that of her husband or her father. So her position was principally determined by the status that she had by virtue of what her father did or by virtue of what her husband did. A New Kingdom text from the Instructions of Ani states this quite nicely. Rank creates its rules. A woman is asked about her husband. A man is asked about his rank. Women were often identified by giving the titles of their husband or the titles of their father. Now, also, we need to keep in mind that the sources that scholars have to work from ancient Egypt are somewhat limited and can have significant gaps, which can make it pretty difficult to give a complete picture of the lives of women in the society. Indeed, these limitations can present obstacles to a complete understanding of Egyptian society as a whole. One of the fathers of the study of ancient Egypt, Sir Alan Gardner, once quipped, "What is proudly advertised as Egyptian history is merely a collection of rags and tatters." Well, we'll be looking at some of those rags and tatters as we try to piece together what the lives of women in ancient Egypt actually looked like. Our knowledge of Egyptian society is based on the study of those types of evidence that form those rags and tatters. These include administrative, legal, and religious texts, literary texts, funerary texts, and also objects of daily life. Now, most of these particular pieces of evidence are actually produced by a male-dominated society. So we should not be confused about the fact that there actually might be the potential for bias even in the sources that we possess, given that they may have been produced by elite males. Now, what also makes Egypt fascinating is the fact that if you think back to the social pyramid, women formed all parts of the strata of that social pyramid. Well, that means that in ancient Egypt, women also were heads of state. They were pharaohs in their own right. This is highly unusual for the ancient world, for women to become heads of state. And in fact, we can count 6 or 7 very good candidates in ancient Egypt for women who attained this very high position. In chronological order, Merenith at the top, all the way down to Cleopatra the 7th at the very bottom right-hand corner. Now, those 6 or potentially 7 female heads of state in ancient Egypt were very significant, but it also must be understood that if you look at the dates for when these females were said to have ruled, they can be very far apart. For example, if you take the reign of Merenith, which is just inside the 3rd millennium BC, and then you look at the second female pharaoh that we know actually ruled, Sobekneferu, you have almost or just over 1,000 years separating those two. So you shouldn't think that this was something that was a consistent feature of ancient Egyptian culture, at least not in the sense of it being something that was quite regular, but it did happen, and that is saying quite a lot. If you think about the fact that Egypt had just over 170 pharaohs and 3,000 years of history, and that 6 or 7 of those individuals happen to be female, you might not think that very impressive until you maybe compare that to some modern states that have yet to have one single female head of state. I'm sure you can think of maybe 1 or 2 countries that might apply to. Indeed, even the queens of pharaohs, the ones considered the great royal wives of the kings, had a special status because queenship itself was considered to carry divine qualities. Kingship definitely did as well, as pharaohs were semi-divine, but queens also carried, especially the great royal wives, also carried that position as well and that quality. They often played very powerful roles behind the scenes, such as Queen T did for her husband Amenhotep III. And they could also be regents for royal heirs who were not yet old enough to rule in their own right, such as the case for the image in the top right-hand corner with Akhasem-Pepi II, who helped her young son Pepi II rule. Now let's take a look at the specific roles of women in ancient Egypt. In literature and funerary art, women's position of mother, daughter, and wife were actually emphasized. Here you can see in this particular tomb painting a wife who is seated behind her husband, and the children of those two individuals are all around. The most important role that a woman could have, of course, was that of a mother, and producing children was very important in ancient Egyptian society. If you look especially at a lot of the statuary and tomb paintings, you often can find the scenes of a husband and his wife side by side. Now, they are often of a slightly different size occasionally, but nonetheless, the fact that the wife is presented right beside the husband shows how very important she was. Usually she is shown when they are beside each other in a supporting pose with a hand around the back or around the waist. Always the male figure is shown in the more prominent position. And if you look at some of the art, usually depending on the way the art is facing, if you read into the face of that art, the male figure is usually the one that's actually out front. You can see that again in this particular image. The viewer's right is the primary position for Egyptian art. And so when a husband and wife are depicted, the husband usually is positioned in the front. And if you flip that, then you can simply see this in a different context here. Now, motherhood is incredibly important. And one of the important New Kingdom wisdom texts that describes motherhood hasn't quite made it onto a Hallmark card yet, but I think it very much should. Here is the text. Double the food your mother gave you. Support her as she supported you. She had a heavy load in you, but she did not abandon you. When you were born after your months, her breast in your mouth for 3 years, as you grew and your excrement disgusted, she was not disgusted, saying, "What shall I do?" When she sent you to school and you were taught to write, she kept watching over you daily with bread and beer in her house, and bread and beer being the staples of any Egyptian diet. Now, pregnancy is not often depicted. You can see from Queen Hatshepsut and King Hatshepsut, mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri, you can see some faint hints of a baby bump here on her mother. And the line drawing probably will help that a little bit more to be able to see. In fact, the practice or the process of giving birth is rarely depicted. And when it is depicted, it looks a little unusual to modern sensibilities because the Egyptians didn't quite render the figure of a baby to look like a cute, chubby, fat baby would look like. They kind of look like miniature adults as they come out. And so here you can see the process of childbirth being depicted, and the actual Egyptian hieroglyph that forms part of the word for giving birth shows this little figure that's coming out, and it's like a sort of little human popping out. Also, very important, here is one of those items that would have been part of daily life, very important. Giving birth in the ancient world was very dangerous. Certainly, there were conditions that would cause this process to be very, very precarious for both the child and the mother, actually. And so here we have archaeological evidence found by the University of Pennsylvania of birthing bricks. And so these would have been bricks that the female would have squatted on while she was giving birth. And if you look at the scene on this brick, you can see once again this sort of small child that has just been birthed. Does not look like a chubby little baby. It looks like maybe you could set it down and it would start toddling around. But nonetheless, what is important is even on these bricks, because giving birth was such a serious act and potentially dangerous, you have images of a female goddess Hathor here to help to provide protection to ensure a safe and healthy birth. Now, the economic contributions of women, or something that we're going to focus on right now, most women did not work outside of the home. The most important title that a woman had, or the most prominent title that a woman had, was the generic title Mistress of the House. I prefer the term that my professor, Dr. Suzanne Onstein, used, domestic engineer, because I think it really gives more of a sense of what women were in charge of in the house. They're primarily doing indoor household activity, and this is sort of their domain. And this actually can be reflected in Egyptian art. If you look at the color that women usually were depicted in and the color that men were depicted in, you can see that the skin color actually indicates sun exposure for the males with a given understanding of where they would typically work, and how that also is going to affect the coloration of the females, given that their work mostly takes place indoors. In fact, if you think of the image slide that I showed just a few minutes ago, here you can see it's very easy to make out the male figures versus the female figures. Male figures are usually depicted in a reddish brown color, and the female figures are typically depicted in sort of a yellowish color, but a lighter color, supposedly due to the fact that they worked indoors more. Now, you shouldn't be fooled into thinking that Egyptian art was presenting things as it actually was. It's very likely that wives often were darker in skin color than their husbands, yet there is a particular Egyptian artistic canon that has to be carried out. And so thus, women would have been depicted with lighter skin, even if in fact they probably had darker skin. Some of the activities that women were involved in and in charge of in the household. Some of these would have been preparing the food, grinding grain, cleaning, child rearing, and weaving cloth. And some of the objects of daily life that we've been able to find show those activities actually taking place. Here you can see the process of bread making. So when grinding on stone, basically, this is a baking bread, and making bread was actually a pretty laborious process because it involved breaking up the whole grains of wheat, of barley in a mortar with a pestle, and you would then grind the result of that on a grindstone to make flour. When grinding on the stone, fine grit can get mixed into the flour, and then it can end up in the bread. And one of the common ailments of the ancient Egyptians, both male and female, because of that diet of eating bread every single day, pretty much every single meal, is that the grit that gets into that bread winds up in your mouth as part of eating that bread, and it can wear away the enamel of the teeth, eventually causing abscesses. And quite often, those abscesses could get infected and could lead to death. And so this is part of the sort of everyday activity of the Egyptians, and women played a very big role as part of that. Here are some images of preserved ancient Egyptian bread. This was bread that was placed inside the tombs and naturally preserved. You probably don't want to eat that, given that it's very hard right now. And remember the grit that we talked about. Brewing is also closely associated with baking, since beer was made from fermented grain. Bakeries and breweries are actually often located right next to each other. And elite families actually butchering, preparing meals, preparing birds and fish, these were actually done by men. And non-elite households, this probably wasn't the case. That's by necessity. In fact, there should be a warning here in that the ideal is not always what takes place in reality. You can look at modern Islamic countries where the ideal would be for women to be in the house, certainly not outside mixing with other individuals and potentially males. But even in Islamic societies and poorer households, women are actually also out working outside and potentially in the fields. And here you can see some of the items of daily life. These are actually little small models that represented activities that went on in daily life. These were placed inside of the tombs in the Middle Kingdom, and with the idea that they had magical properties. And so what you enjoyed in this life, all of those activities would still take place. So if you're the owner of a large estate and you have many, many, many rooms in your house and many activities taking place there, you want those to continue in the afterlife as well. This is showing those items as they were found. Here you can see some of those items cleaned up. Women were actually excluded from all craft production except weaving, but keep in mind, once again, that the overseer of the house, if this was a large household, would technically be involved and in charge of overseeing that all of those particular activities actually gets done. Here you can see some more of those activities from those items of daily life. Now, here to sort of reinforce this idea, you can actually see some weaving that's going on. Keep in mind, once again, the fact that the women are being shown in a light yellowish skin color here. And it really is a shame that we don't have a lot of archaeological evidence for ancient Egyptian houses. Part of the reason for that is that a lot of these houses would have been built in areas that modern Egyptian homes are actually currently built on top of. And so that's a problem. Another aspect would be relating to the materials that these homes were built of. Although temples were built of stone, and whether these be mortuary temples or pyramids, for homes, they were built of mud brick. And mud brick does not survive as well as stone, obviously. So we don't have a lot of archaeological evidence for what ancient Egyptian homes actually looked like. We have, such as this image here at Kahun, we have some specialized towns that were important. In this case, this was a pyramid town. So people lived here, they worked here. We can look at the foundations of those particular houses to get a sense of how large they were. And we can also look at least the floor plan of the houses and determine what kinds of activities actually took place there. But we don't have intact Egyptian homes left for us. I'll show an image in a little bit from the community of Deir el-Medina, which gives us a better sense of some of the walls that remain of those particular houses. Now, thinking of the role that women play in those houses, and remember that title, domestic engineer, mistress of the house. Here from our good friend, the Instruction of Ani, once again, we have an admonition to a husband, and here it is. Do not control your wife in her house. Basically, the idea is she knows what her responsibilities are. So when you know that she is efficient, don't say to her, where is it, get it? When she has put it in the right place, let your eye observe in silence. Then you recognize her skill. If a man desists from strife at home, he will not encounter its beginning. Now, and also looking at other aspects of the economic contributions of women, there were outdoor activities that women were involved in. Of that, we're absolutely certain. some of these outdoor activities involved working and selling goods in the marketplace. Now, if you're selling goods in the marketplace, it's likely then that those women would have been of a lower socioeconomic status. Sometimes these women sold surplus goods, or potentially produce from the house. The woven handicrafts that they produced in the home might then have been sold outside as well. You can see this from the tomb of Neakhnum and Khnumhotep at Saqqara. In the bottom left-hand corner, there is a female in the market, and she's very clearly selling goods to males that are there to purchase. Here from another scene at Saqqara as well, you can see women clearly involved both in selling and buying as well. And another image giving you an idea of women that are participating. In this case, they are actually buying from males as well. And so what these images give you an idea of is the fact that although the ideal would be that women would have worked inside the home, we know that women also worked outside the home. They interacted with men in the marketplace. And keep in mind, remember what Herodotus was shocked by. He's shocked by the fact that these kinds of scenes were scenes that he didn't see very often in the Greek city-states. Also, women might actually work for wealthy families as domestic servants. They could work as nannies or wet nurses. They could be hairdressers and personal attendants of the lady of the house, of the mistress of the house. Here we see some of those images which give us an idea of the importance of nurses. And some of these could be really important wet nurses. So you shouldn't think that a nurse would be someone necessarily that has a very low status. In fact, the left-hand picture here actually shows a young king who is seated on the lap of his nurse. And so this was something that many queens needed to have a wet nurse for their children, because what they're trying to do is they're trying to produce more children. And although it was typical for ancient Egyptian children to be breastfed at least for 3 years, and prolonging the lactation process is known to help to prevent pregnancies. For queens, they want to have as many children as possible so that they can produce the heirs of their husband. And so breastfeeding your own children would not have been conducive to that. They also could be professional musicians and dancers. They could have played a number of instruments, harps, lyres, flutes, percussive instruments, and we have plenty of evidence from Egyptian tomb scenes of these particular activities actually taking place. Here you can see playing the flute and dancing that's going along with that, playing the lyre and the harp and so forth. And so a number of these particular scenes are showing these activities and dancing as well. One of my favorite scenes actually involves not so much dancing, but mourning, professional mourners. This was something that was an occupation that women could participate in. And these did not necessarily have to be women that had any idea who the deceased individual actually was that they're helping to mourn for. This practice still goes on in countries today in modern times, but what we see here is a lot of distress and wailing, showing how important this individual, the deceased, actually was. And so these professional mourners, you can imagine if the person was very important, then a number of professional mourners, the more professional mourners that you had, the more that you understood how important this person was and how distraught people are for having lost this great person in society. What I really love about this particular image, though, is that there is a small girl, young girl, who apparently has decided to join her sisters and maybe even her mom to the event that they are mourning at. And she is pictured at the very bottom. Now she's small and she's naked. And so that gives you an idea that young girls are depicted absolutely naked. So you get the idea that she is definitely, young here, probably, 6, 7 or so. And she's decided to go with mom or her sisters or whatever to work today. And she's pretending to mourn just like they are. So she's, getting some on the job training here. Here's an item, one of those percussive instruments, a sistrum, which if you shake it, has a little bit of a rattle to it. And we know that women were also involved in the religious cults as well, certainly in temples to, say, Hathor. They could be priestesses in the Temple of Hathor, but also for the cult of Amun as well. And you can see the some women who are actually shaking the sistrum here in this particular scene, and accompanying text, see her hands shaking the sistra to bring pleasure to the god, her father Amun. How lovely she moves, her hair bound with ribbon, songstress with perfect features. Pleasure there is in her lips' motions. Her heart is all kindness, her words gentle to those upon earth. One lives just to hear her voice. Another instrument that we might not think of as an instrument is really a necklace that is held here. You can see this female holding it, a menot necklace, and you can actually see the item, the real item right here, kind of created sort of a rustling sound. And so shaking that would provide a little bit of percussion and to sort of various rhythms of the dancers. Now, if we shift and look at the rights of women in ancient Egypt, what we can see is when we look at their legal rights, the formal legal status of Egyptian women, and this is married, unmarried, divorced, widowed, was nearly identical with that of Egyptian men. Egyptian women were able to acquire, to own, and to dispose of property, both real and personal, in their own name. This is quite striking, certainly when compared to other ancient societies at the time. For example, say Greek and Roman civilization, but also Chinese civilization as well, and even some parts of ancient Mesopotamia. They could also initiate divorce, and that is important as well. Now, women and some of their rights we're able to glean from a number of documents, which are precious to us because those rags and tatters, remember, we have so few of them. There's one that's quite striking. So it's the will of a woman by the name of Naunacht. Now, this particular document comes from the 12th century BC, but I want you to keep in mind, it's over 3,000 years old. And yet, I think you can still get a sense of the agitation of this particular woman. Now, let me set the context for you. This is a will, and it is depicting or portraying the fact that Naunacht is attempting to disinherit a few of her children. Now, Naunacht was married to a previous husband who has died and had no children from that previous husband. She remarries, and from that husband has 8 children. And those 8 children are the ones who are being discussed in this particular document. Now, there are 14 witnesses that are part of this document. And the fact that she is there, Naunacht, and her children are there as well, and these witnesses, this is very important and sort of legally binding document. Let's take a look at it for a second. Now, she lives in a small community called Deir el-Medina. Now, Deir el-Medina basically is the workman's village, the workers who actually tunneled and created the tombs in the Valley of the Kings lived here. And they lived here over a number of centuries. And so the New Kingdom is when this particular neighborhood was actually active. And you can see the blue circle here giving you an idea. This village, you can see it today, or the remains of it today. It's quite striking, actually, how much of it is preserved. It's pretty far off the beaten path in terms of off the cultivation. So it's out in the desert, and it is within walking distance of the Valley of the Kings. Here you can see some of the archaeological excavation that's gone on here to show at least the lower parts of the walls of these particular houses. We can tell that the village probably consisted of around 120 workmen and their families. So at its height, it may have exceeded 1,000 people. So Naunacht lived in one of those homes that you see here. And they were actually quite nice. This is an unusual community in the sense that not only were most of the males who lived here literate, but many of the females who lived here were literate as well. Why that is striking is that scholars believe that maybe an estimated 1 to 3% of adults in ancient Egypt could actually read and write. Overwhelmingly, those would have been male, and they formed part of the bureaucracy. And so that is something that at least here, you don't have 1 to 3%. You probably have maybe upwards of 40% or even more that were literate in this community. So here is part of that document. As for me, I am a free woman of the land of Pharaoh. I brought up these 8 servants of yours and gave them a household. Now, these 8 servants of yours, those are her 8 children. Everything as is customarily done for those of their standing. But look, I am grown old, and look, they do not care for me in turn. Whichever of them has given me a hand, to him I will give of my property. Whichever has not, to him I will not give my property. Can you not feel the indignation that she feels towards children that have very clearly not been good to her? All right, she is going to exercise some of her authority and in how she divvies up her own particular wealth. So she goes on. As for these 4 children of mine, so these are the 4 children who did not respect her, who have not treated her well. They shall not share in the division of any of my property. And as for any property of the scribe Kinher-Kepesheth, my first husband, and also his real estate, and also this storeroom of my father, and also this oipe of emmer, this is a quantity of emmer, which I received with my husband, they will not share in them. Now, it's important to sort of work through this quickly. She's telling you in this document, and we're able to glean from this document, that 1, she has property from her first husband that belongs to her alone, and she can do with it as she pleases. 2, she has a storeroom from her father. She inherited this from her father that is also her own private possession. 3, a third of her possessions since she married her husband that's the father of these particular children also actually belongs to her. What she is basically doing, she is disinheriting the 4 children from the possessions, from her own possessions. So she's saying, you can't have any of the property that belonged to my first husband. You cannot have any of the a share in the storeroom that her father left her. And also, you can't have the 1/3 of the possessions that she shares jointly with her husband. This is quite fascinating. It also gives you an idea of the authority that women had, and not only being able to accumulate possessions, but also in being able to distribute those as they see fit with their own property. Another document gives you an idea of the fact that women were regularly landowners in their own right. This particular papyrus, so the Wilbur papyrus, also dates to the 12th century BC, gives you an idea. It actually lists recorded sort of taxes that were due on farmland from Middle Egypt. And what's interesting is it gives the owners of those land, of that particular pieces of land, and if you go through and look at all of these particular names, what you can find is about 10% of the landowners that are being taxed for the land that they own, about 10% of the ones that are mentioned are women. So once again, women are able to own land in their own right, not with a male guardian, not, sort of having to go through a male intermediary to be able to have that. It also shows you that they also had the privilege of paying taxes, and that seems to be a common feature throughout ancient societies and even the modern world as well. Now, it shouldn't surprise you that what was on the books, the legal rights that women had, sometimes in reality, it didn't always match the ideal. It does seem that women understood, or men understood, that women in ancient Egypt could exercise a significant amount of authority. And here in an ancient Egyptian text, you get the saying, "Do not contend with her in court. Keep her from power, restrain her. Her eye is her storm when she gazes. Thus will you make her stay in your house." That first part of this text, "do not contend with her in court," helps us to understand actually that women were able to be witnesses in court. In fact, remember that Naunacht was a witness at the writing of her will. Women were able to testify in court. Their testimony was equal to that of a male. And in fact, they could be brought to court, accused of various crimes, and they would be able to give a defense for themselves. There are documents which relate to women being brought to court, and they're able to defend themselves. There is one particular female who was accused of actually stealing some copper tools from a local religious context, and she was brought to court. She was accused of having stolen these copper tools. Now, just to give you an idea, copper is very, very valuable in the ancient world, and so these tools were quite valuable. She denied having taken the tools, and they decided to go and to search her house, and lo and behold, they found the copper tools. We do not have the end of this particular document to help us to understand how this particular case ended. It's very likely, though, that she would have been in significant trouble and most likely executed because of the theft of that very valuable property that ultimately belonged to Pharaoh. And in fact, everything technically belongs to Pharaoh anyway. Once again, that could also be something that is more ideal than real. It also might help to very briefly just mention that Egypt is incredibly polytheistic when it comes to religion. They worship many, many deities, as did almost all ancient societies. In Egypt, the number of these deities runs into the hundreds, but there were dozens of these deities that were goddesses, and they were quite prominent in their own right in Egypt's pantheon. And so that's another difference that you find from ancient Egypt and from other contemporary cultures, is that many of these female deities, they exercise enormous power in that pantheon. And that was also symbolic of the power that women held in ancient Egyptian society as well. In fact, maybe the most important concept, without a doubt, the most important concept in all of ancient Egyptian religion and society was represented by a goddess. So Ma'at is a concept that means order, but not just any kind of order. This is sort of divine cosmic order, the kind of order that can only be provided ultimately by the Pharaoh himself, who is the God's representative on earth. In fact, the most important thing that the Pharaoh could do was to have order, to maintain Ma'at. And this included making sure that the Nile overflowed its banks at the normal time every year, and that it was just the right amount of water to irrigate the land. This means also making sure that when armies went out to fight foreign armies, that the Egyptians always prevailed. That is what order actually is. It's the opposite of a concept in ancient Egypt called isfet, which means chaos. And so Ma'at, very important. Oftentimes you'll see depictions of the pharaoh in the temples of the ancient Egyptian gods, and they're actually offering Ma'at, the image of Ma'at, to those gods. And that's the most important and the most precious gift that they could give them to keep Egyptian society running smoothly. Well, Ma'at is a female goddess. And in fact, you can see how important this is, not just in the pharaoh's life, but also in the everyday Egyptian's life as well. From a scene of the Egyptian Book of the Dead, you have the final and most important part of the judgment in the afterlife. This is the weighing of the heart. All right. And so here you have the deceased individual's heart being placed on the scales of justice, and they're weighing that person's heart against a feather. Well, the feather actually represents Ma'at. It represents truth. And you can see, if you look at the image of the goddess, the top right hand of the slide, you can see that she's wearing a feather in her head. Well, that particular feather represents Ma'at. And the deceased's heart is actually being weighed against the feather, because throughout this life, the person's heart has basically recorded all of their deeds. And if this person has done good deeds, then the heart is light. If the person has done bad deeds, then the heart is heavy with all of these misdeeds. And in fact, the heart is going to outweigh the feather of truth, the Ma'at feather, and that will be very bad for it. If that were the case, then the goddess at the left-hand corner of the slide, Ammit, is going to devour that particular heart. You can see that Ammit is sitting there in the scroll, the Book of the Dead, and Ammit is also a female goddess, is awaiting the result of this particular trial and hoping that in fact it turns out poorly, because that means a snack for it. Now, Ammit is very interesting because Ammit is a composite animal here. And what the Egyptians basically did was they took the three most dangerous animals that they were familiar with, that were people killers. And so you see the head is a crocodile. The upper body of this particular goddess, usually portrayed as either a lion or sometimes a leopard. The spots give it away. And then the hind end is actually a hippo. So rather than thinking of simply one animal to represent the nightmare scenario for most Egyptians, which is that your heart would be eaten and you would go into non-existence at this trial, they present the three most frightening and ferocious animals that they had to fear, and they just sort of smash them together, and thus you have Ammit. Now, let's conclude. First, it must be understood that ancient Egypt was certainly a patriarchal society. All right. We might say that ancient Egypt was not as patriarchal as other societies in the ancient world, but they certainly were a patriarchal society. It's a male-dominated society. Under certain rare conditions, women could achieve ultimate power. They could actually serve as pharaohs. But we need to understand that that's an exception. It's not the rule. When there were viable male candidates, almost never did you have a female attain the highest position of pharaoh. And typically, this would be women acting as a royal stopgap. The dynastic line has come to an end, and there are no males to attain this position, and so therefore power passes to a female. But even then, most of those females that become pharaoh usually were either the daughter of a king, the wife of a king, sometimes potentially the mother of a king as well. And then when a female pharaoh has ascended the throne, usually what follows is a return to male rule, and usually for quite some time. Second, Egyptian women made economic contributions to the household. Remember their important title of mistress of the house, or as I prefer, domestic engineer. They were occasionally businesswomen in the marketplace, etc. And these were roles that were valued by men. Finally, women were equal under the law. They could inherit, they could disinherit, and they could initiate divorce. All in all, the place of women in Egyptian society definitely made them unusual when compared to other ancient societies at that time. Thus, the reason our good friend Herodotus could come and be so amazed and maybe even shocked that women were able to do things in Egypt that they simply were not able to do in his own area of ancient Greece. Well, I hope you enjoyed the talk tonight, and I hope you learned something as well. Thank you.